Thanks everyone for coming. So today is really our excuse to pick Mar's brain. This is Mar Cusso, the painting conservator that we are very lucky to be able to work with here. But I thought before we move into doing that, Clarissa and I would first introduce the two artists that we're talking about. So we're sitting here in Gallery 5 of the Southeast Asia Galleries. Covers the early to middle 20th century, and it's a very special gallery in the narrative of the Southeast Asia Galleries, because this is where we see two things happening. One, the emergence of kind of newly professionalised institutions and infrastructures for art. So for example, the establishment of art schools, art collectives, and so on. And two, a kind of self-conscious breaking away from some of the sort of more realistic or naturalistic modes of representation that we've seen in the previous galleries down the hall. So the two artists that we're introducing today, Emiria Sunassa from Indonesia and Saya Myit from Myanmar, both embody different aspects of those two narratives that we talk about in this room. So first, Clarissa will talk about Emiria Sunassa.
Yeah, so Emiria is really just, she's a mysterious figure in Indonesian art. And that also actually had, a lot to do with her being a very sole woman artist among like a group of male artists. And there were a lot of like myths that kind of perpetuated, about her. And we really have also to thank Heidi Arbuckle, who wrote her thesis on Emiria in 2011. And so some of the things that are said about her, that she was a nurse, a student of eurythmics, which is like rhythmic bodily movement timed to music, which I guess is another way of saying dancing. She was a singer and pianist, and those that claim to have known her said she was an elephant hunter, a poison maker, that she was a tiger woman, and she also claimed actually to be the princess of the Tidore Sultanate. And the interesting thing about Heidi Arbuckle's thesis is that, a lot of things, she wasn't really able also to, substantiate, because a lot of the information was anecdotal. And yeah, as I mentioned, she was just a rare female painter among, this male group of artists. And she was a member of Persagi, and she participated in one of their landmark exhibitions in 1940. And then, mysteriously, like, what a lot of said about her was that she just kind of disappeared, from the art scene in the 1960s, and she was largely forgotten in Indonesian art history. And it was through, Heidi's thesis that she was able to kind of claim that she actually passed away in 1964. So yeah, so she's a very interesting artist. And as with the next one.
Yeah, so Saya Myit is also something of a mysterious figure, as are many of the artists from Myanmar who were active in the late 19th and early 20th century. Saya Myit perhaps more so than others in that, unlike many of his contemporaries, most of his works kind of disappeared for much of the 20th century and were only started to sort of reappear in Myanmar around the 1990s when some researchers began to do work there. But what we do know about Saya Myit is that he was initially trained in so-called traditional art, so in other words making paintings for chiefly kind of religious and ritual purposes. He trained under a traditional artist whose main kind of bread and butter was to make paintings for the funerals of monks. But then he very quickly became associated with something called the Burma Art Club, which was established in the 1910s in Rangoon, as it was then, by some British artists, and was really the first kind of semi-formal institution to teach kind of Western modes of drawing and painting from life. So he has these kind of two tracks in his work, if you like, the sort of traditional paintings and the kind of Western style representational realist paintings like the one we see over here. From a very young age, though, he was already sort of celebrated for his skill in realistic painting, and there's a funny little anecdote that I thought I would share from one of the articles about him that when he was a child studying at a monastery outside of Yangon, he painted on a surface in the monastery some vines and leaves and a bunch of fruit. And it was so realistic that a squirrel saw the fruit and thought it was real and jumped to try and eat it and knocked over the painting in the process. So this sort of legend, you know, of course we have no way of knowing if this is true or not, but the fact that this legend has been sort of passed on through generations, mostly orally, is a sign that his ability to kind of render realistically, as you see in this artwork over here, was really celebrated and was really sort of central to his fame and his position in Myanmar art history. Like many of his contemporaries, he also worked for the kind of emerging new industries of the bustling cosmopolitan port city that was Yangon. So he worked for the Tiger Balm Company, and he also worked for one of the Myanmar film studios that made a number of Burmese language feature films from the early 1920s onwards. But beyond this, we know very little about him, and many of the works of his that have survived, mostly in private collections in Myanmar, some in museums like in Fukuoka and here, have survived in not particularly good condition. So, as with Emiria Sunassa, there's a lot of conservation work that needs to be done for us to be able to appreciate the kind of techniques and skills that have gone into the paintings and to understand what they might have looked like originally and trace the history of the form. So with that, maybe we can turn to what we're all here for, which is to ask Mar about the conservation process for these two paintings. We had a little bit of a chat about this beforehand, and we thought before we get started, one question that often comes up is if you could just tell us what is conservation? What's the difference between conservation and restoration?
Wonderful. That's my favorite question. So basically, I'm so glad that we managed to get along together and gather to discuss about this, because during the conservation process, I didn't work on my own. We worked together on the decision making, on the treatment approach that we wanted to decide for both paintings. So conservation is a discipline that requires a lot of knowledge, a lot of different things come into place, and basically the most important thing is having in mind the ethics of what is the correct way to approach and what is the most respectful way to approach an artist's work. So our code of ethics, which is internationally more or less the same, stands for minimal intervention, maximum respect to the original. All the materials that we use are materials that can be reversed, and during all the process of every single thing we do, we document everything so that everybody can revise afterwards what has been introduced into the painting. So that is really important, and that's what makes us different from restoration, because our approach when we do a treatment on a painting is not really trying to make the painting look like it looks new, nothing ever happened, and you can't see cracks or you can't see certain things that are due to the pass of time or the patina that time leaves on the painting. So working in an institution, in a museum, is actually wonderful, because that's really where conservation can be really put into place. Because when working in private practice, there's more of a restoration approach. So inside this process of decision making comes discussing with different partners. So it's more of an interdisciplinary approach, because we need to discuss with curators. We need to understand everything that they know about the artist, and also compare with other works from the same artist, because we also have to put into context what we find in the painting that we're going to be treating. And yeah, understanding the art history of the artist, then understanding as much about materials as we can, which is something we're really trying to build up now, because in the Heritage Conservation Center, which is where I currently do my work, we have a new science lab, which is like amazing and a dream for a conservator. We have all the machines, all the equipment, and basically all the paintings in this gallery still need to be researched from the material side, because we know very little about materials, and also the materials used by Southeast Asia can be always compared with the Western materials or what the Western artists use. So there's a large database on Western artists and Western materials, but there's not really much on Southeast Asia. So this is one of the tasks that we do during our job, which is quite exciting, because it's kind of like a little bit of forensic, trying to understand what lies underneath, what the artist may have chosen this or that. And yeah, that's why we use the equipment as well for. So when we were treating these two paintings, oh yeah, this is the photo documentation examination. This is part of the photo documentation that we carry out. So once the paintings come out to the lab, the first thing we do is we take photo documentation with different types of lightings, and these lightings is called multi-spectra image taking. So with the different spectra of the light, we can see different things. So here you can see this is the composition of a paint layer. So these are all the different layers that can be found in a painting. Doesn't mean that they always have all of this. This is more or less what can be found, because certain artists decide to paint on top of the support without applying any priming or applying any sizing, or they may be not under drawing. So with the different lightings, we can see with the different spectrums, we can see different layers. So with the UV light, which is the one with the UV light, with the ultraviolet radiation, what we can see is the varnish layers, because they fluoresce in a very particular way. So if we are concerned about having previous varnish layers that we want to observe and see, we can also see how they have been applied, because with that UV filter, normally you can see if it's evenly applied or if it's uneven, which is also very important when it comes into cleaning, because that will have an impact also on our cleaning process, because if it's not all consistent, we will have to bear that in mind. And then we can also see the retouchings. So if anything has been previously retouched, the retouchings will appear darker in color. They will fluoresce like in a dark spot type. And then with the X-ray, what we can see is further in. So we can see if there's any underneath layers or any under painting. So sometimes some artists decided to overpaint over previous paintings, and then that can tell us if there's something underneath. For this, we need to collaborate with the Singapore hospital, because we don't have an X-ray machine with us, also because it requires a lot of health and safety and permissions and things like that, and also it's very expensive. So, I mean, X-ray is not a thing we commonly do. I mean, we don't X-ray every single painting. I mean, when we come into doing this type of examination, you need to reason, and I mean, the trained eye of a conservator can sometimes tell you, oh, I feel there's something here, because looking under the microscope sometimes also helps understand if there's something underneath. So if it comes into place and we have a good justification, then we prepare a list, and I think 4 times a year we collaborate with the Singapore hospital. So we bring the paintings to the hospital. Then the hospital people are very excited because they get to see things that they don't normally see. And yeah, and we get to understand what is underneath. So actually, I put into this slide because for the Emiria Sunassa, we did take an X-ray because we were a bit hoping to see something underneath. So yeah, I will show you later now what we saw. So, okay, so this is the first painting I will talk about the treatment. And this is an example of a minimal intervention treatment. So actually, both paintings have a very different approach. And I thought it was great to share with you these 2 very different cases, because it's also showing how every single intervention is different. There's no one magical recipe to restore paintings. Every painting has a different need, and actually you understand what the painting needs once you engage into a dialogue with the artwork, which is something very weird, but it's something that happens. So first you take the photographies of your painting, then you start looking at the painting, because it is a very reflective work doing conservation. It's not just a hands-on skill where you know how to paint, you know how to mix color, and you just go all over the place. So when we were looking at this painting, there were a few issues concerning the structural side of it, because the artist decided to use a plywood to paint this piece, which is something a lot of artists do, but unfortunately it's not our best friend, plywood, because it's not very good. I mean, it deteriorates quite easily, so actually, yeah, it's a bit of a nightmare for us. But then artists decide to use whatever they use. So, I mean, it's a cheap material. It's a very accessible material. So the reason why she decided, we don't know, but it may have just been that. It's just cheap, easy to find, and yeah, she decided to use this. So unfortunately, plywood is a very unstable material support, and it suffers a lot from the fluctuations and the extreme Southeast Asian climate. So what happened with this plywood is it's also a very thin plywood layer, so it delaminated with time. So when the humidity goes up and goes down, all these fluctuations cause extreme cracks on the wood, because wood is an organic material that will continue moving it's like alive. It will continue moving all its life. So when it moves, these cracks, what they did is that they created like a gap of air. So they open, then they can't close back, then the paint also needs to move at the same time that the support, and all of this causes a lot of stress on the painting. So there's also an added thing, which is somebody decided to add another plywood to the original plywood. This we don't know if it may have been the artist herself. I mean, we can't tell. From what simple observation, we can't just see who may have done this. It may have been her herself, or somebody else trying to stop the already deterioration of all the cracks and the bubbles of air, the gaps that were being created in the support. And unfortunately, it's very irreversible, because applying another wood onto another wood is not the best choice, because the other wood will continue moving in different directions. So it doesn't stop the process, it actually creates more tensions on the support. So unfortunately, it's irreversible because they use an epoxy resin. Is really hard, and removing it will cause a lot of damage on the paint, and it's really extreme treatment, and yeah, we definitely would never go for that. So what we decided to do is, I mean, once we looked at it, and then we took the photos, and then it comes into here is when it comes the X-ray. Maybe we can go to the next. So these are the different UV, the different lights that we use for the photo documentation. So this is just normal light, so just the visible spectrum what we can all see. And then this is the UV light, which already shows you here, you can see these darker areas are all the areas of retouching. That means that it's not original. It means it's not original or contemporary to the time the paint was painting. But that doesn't tell us if the artist herself may have done it. Because even if something is retouched, I mean, we do find a lot of artists that retouch their paintings themselves. So even when you see that, doesn't mean, oh, I'm going to remove it because this is not the artist's intention. It's some other conservator that tried their best, but they did it in a very patchy way. Let's try to remove it. You have to think about, okay, what is the next step we can take to understand what's going on? That's why we decided to take an X-ray to see if we could see how much could we find underneath that repainting. Unfortunately, sometimes we sometimes we use certain techniques and it doesn't always give us the answer. So in this case, this is the X-ray image of the painting, which comes in different sizes because we need to stitch the images because they can't take the image in a full size. They take different photos and then we stitch them together. And yeah, it doesn't show us much of what we can find underneath. So it wasn't really giving us the answer to our question. After gathering all of this, we discussed back with curators, and we all, met up together. So we saw the evidences of what we have managed to gather, and then we decided that we don't have any reference, and we don't have enough information to embark into removing that area that seems like a later touch-up, because we also don't know if she may have done it herself due to the bad condition of the support that was already showing all these cracks and all these gaps in between the plywood layers. So yeah, we decided not to go ahead with that intervention because it's very extreme and it's irreversible. I mean, in the meaning that when you decide to clean and remove something, there's no way back. So these type of things, maybe in the future we will be able to do further research and then maybe decide to go ahead. But at this point, this was not the decision we wanted to go ahead with. So at this point, we decided that what we had to do was just stabilize the support, make sure that all those gaps and all those bubbles of air were secure. So next slide. Oh yeah,
So this is actually, we took this also from Heidi's thesis, but the black and white photo you see there is what appeared in Emiria Sunassa's catalog of her solo show in 1946. And then you have the colored image, so that is actually of the painting in our collection. So you can see actually there are some slight differences. So whether, our painting may have been, the one from 1946, and then Emiria, added onto herself, reworked her paintings at a later date. I mean, that's also possible. And she's known to actually have been, to have done this with some of her other paintings. So, I mean, she could have also just made another version of her painting. That's also possible. But we felt with the information that we had, we weren't comfortable with removing the later additions to the painting, because it actually could have been done by the artist herself.
Maybe just to add on there, that part of the reason why we have evidence that she retouched and remade and reworked other paintings, that this is something that she liked to do. But what we don't have for Emiria is her own correspondence or her own writings, and this sort of sets her apart from other members of the Pasaji collective that she was a member of. So one of the founders of that collective, Sujayono, whose paintings you see many of in the next gallery, was not only a prolific artist but also wrote extensively about his work and the philosophy of his work, and his journals and personal records and so on were kept by his family and are now held together in an estate. None of this exists for Emiria. Heidi's entire thesis relies on kind of other people's accounts, memories, things she can piece together from exhibition records and so on. So we don't have the artist's own kind of archival word about her intentions. So that's sort of part of the reason why we choose to proceed very carefully. Yeah.
So in the next slide, you can see, this is another type of photo technique that we use when we first document the paintings upon arrival. This is a raking light, which is a 45-degree angle light that is wonderful to show distortions or unevenness, like topography unevenness on the surface. So here you can already see all these bubbles of air have caused all these gaps and all this unevenness in the painting, which actually, were quite bad and disturbing in order to appreciate properly the painting. So we decided to focus on that and try to, amend that as much as possible. So when it came to deciding which material to use, which is already the next slide, what we did was we decided to kind of try to recreate the wooden material that had already been lost due to all these movements, because there was a lot of empty gaps in between. So what we did is we use a paper paste, which is cellulose at the end. So we were trying kind of to re-inject cellulose, so these whole areas will be bulked back in, and the structure will be sound and stable again. So we use an adhesive that is also cellulose-based, and then we mix together with the paper pulp, and then we introduce this, because the gaps were quite big, we introduced the paper pulp inside. So what we did is we just closed those gaps, then we used infill material to create, to level all the area, and then we did some minimum retouching, because there were just lines of the cracks that had to be retouched. So yeah, this is really, I think it was really, we were happy with this treatment. The painting now can be seen there's still, when you see it from the side, you can still see some unevenness, but that's what it is. We can't put back all the wood, because once wood starts moving, it's very difficult to create again a flat surface and recreate the whole surface, but the gaps have been filled. So this has helped align some of the cracks, because some were higher and some were smaller. So we tried to build them up so we could just align them both together. And I think now it looks okay. So we were happy with it. This is a minimal approach. It's just not very intervention. It's just more structural, which is sometimes what really some of the paintings that we have require, especially if, as the curators say, we don't have that much information to be able to trace whatever happened to this painting. So yeah, this I think is a very respectful approach, and yeah, this is how we decided to go ahead with this. So yeah, for this painting, I think that's more or less it. Maybe we can go to the next one. This is a good example of a much more extensive intervention. So that's why this is kind of like the opposite of going into a minimal approach. This painting, when it came into the collection, it was not in very good condition. It wasn't so much of a structural issue, it was more like an aesthetical issue. So unfortunately, it had very big distortions, massive undulations, and it was painted on a canvas, and it had been secured to a cardboard. So it wasn't. It would have been originally stretched on a stretcher, but the stretcher was not present anymore. So we started taking the photo documentation. Go to the next one, as we did before in the other one. So this raking light can also show you how extreme the undulations were. So actually, the painting had totally lost its original, like, a fabric is meant to have some flexibility. This painting was hard like a rock. It was like a cardboard, because all these undulations had really, like, toughened the surface and had made it very, not very flexible. So we took different raking lights. We take it from different angles. So here, you can see, especially on the edges, it was quite extreme. And then you took also a UV light photo, which shows how, this is a good example of how uneven the varnish layer is, because it may have been possible that somebody had tried to remove the varnish from the face, because the fluorescence of the varnish layer on the face is much lower. So this was also very important when we went ahead to carry on the varnish removal, because we had to be aware that this layer was not even. So when you are carrying, at the end you use your hand and you use a cotton swab, and you have to be carefully and sensitive enough not to over clean certain areas that may have a lower, like a thinner layer of varnish. So there's another photo, I think, that shows the details of the face. So this is a good example of different lights, which includes also infrared light. So infrared is another spectrum, which is the one that we use to show the underdrawing, and if there's any pencil or any sketch that the artist may have done. So yeah, in this case, I don't think there was much pencil found, but it was just such a beautiful image that we just wanted to add. And yeah, this shows normal light, raking light, again UV light, with some patchy areas, because the green tone will be the varnish, and the areas that look a bit more violish are just paint without varnish. So yeah, they show how uneven, with normal light you could already see it was very uneven, the varnish layer. So when it came to this, we talked with the curators, because this varnish was very yellowed as well, and it was very disturbing because it wasn't showing this rich palette of colors that are like very vibrant. So what we do normally is we do some solubility test to find out if the varnish is reversible without compromising the original layer, because sometimes we also may find ourselves that some things may not be reversed without compromising the underneath. So yeah, we need to find if we can find the perfect solvent that can allow us to work safely without touching the paint layer at all. And we did some tests. So I think it's the next image. So we did this test, and then Roger and Clarissa came over to the lab, and then we discussed and decided if this was really gonna help show the painting in the best way it should be shown, and showing the real original colors. We felt comfortable because it was safe and it was not compromising the original paint layer. So yeah, we decided to go ahead and remove this very disturbing varnish layer and very yellowed. And yes.
Oh, yes. So I put this slide here just to sort of give an indication of, if you look at the painting hanging on the wall over there with the sort of the rich, vibrant colours, the really sort of saturated pink in the longi, the very sort of saturated green velvet-looking tablecloth, all of the textures of different fabrics that the artist has taken such care to depict. That gives us a sense of what the original vibrancy might have been like in other contemporaneous works from Myanmar. So on the left here we have another portrait, very similar sort of compositional style and genre, attributed also to Saya Myit, but you can see this painting is in much worse condition. Seeing now the one we have on the wall after it's been cleaned up, we can just sort of imagine the richness of colour that might have originally been there. And then likewise on the right is another artist, Saya A, a slightly older generation, this is a painting that's actually painted on zinc. This work has also been conserved, but this is as bright as the colours can get, because they've simply, as a result of the kind of chemical reactions on the zinc, they've faded over time. But this painting is actually on display now down the hallway in Gallery 2. So looking at it, it's quite wonderful to see now the sort of fineness of the line work underneath these faded colours. But seeing the vibrancy of the Conserve painting here, we can sort of imagine that this too would once have been full with these rich, saturated tones. So in other words, this is an example where we as curators and art historians really learn from the conservators.
And we learn from them because they also share with us all this material, you know, because as I said before, we need to put into context. I mean, we need to look at all the pieces from the same artist or what was being painted at the same time. I mean, we can't just isolate every painting. That's why we need to also know the hard history behind to understand and put it into context. So this was rather complicated because we also work under very tight deadlines and time. So that's also kind of like the reality of how we work, because this painting had to be ready for rotation. And it was a new acquisition that came in, I think, 2 years ago, something like that. So it had been pending for conservation. So we had to speed up and think about a process that would be fast and effective. And we did have a time deadline here that was really pushing. So what we did in this case is, what we had to do is we had to kind of like bring back the flexibility to the fabric that had been lost due to all those tensions that the support had suffered. And actually the tensions had been due to the fluctuations again of the humidity, especially humidity. I mean, temperature is not so much of an issue, but humidity is really an issue because this is a cotton canvas. Cotton canvas is extremely sensitive to humidity. And being exposed to that is definitely gonna cause problems. In addition, this painting was quite particular because it has a paint layer on the front, but it has a second paint layer on the back, which is just a plain color, which may have been used as an isolation layer. It may have been done by the artist. It may have been done by somebody afterwards trying to preserve the canvas from moving. But that is not a good option either because you're stopping the canvas from moving. The canvas is still going to want to move. Then you have the tensions of the paint drying in one way, the paint on the back drying in another way. So this is why this canvas was so stiff. So what we did is we created a humidity chamber. So we have this Lascaux stretcher, which is wonderful because you can open it and close it depending on how you want to work on it. And then we have these craft paper stripes, which have a methylcellulose glue as well. So what we do is we glue them on the canvas, and then when it's inside the humidity chamber, the vapor of the water that will start coming through will reactivate this glue, and then when this glue dries back again, it will tense. It will cause some tension on the canvas. So we repeated this process like 5 or 6 times, because also wanting to bring back to the original status of a canvas when it was originally flexible and as it would have been, is something you need to do slowly. You can't, because it's very stressful as well, and the paint also suffers from it. So it's a process you have to slowly do it and try to move it back to what it would have been before. So we repeated the process. We put it inside the chamber like 2 hours or 1 hour and a half, depending. We did different timings. We had a bucket of water underneath with saturated water. And this is something that helped help give back and remove all these undulations as well slowly. So the next photo. So this is when we got to the stage where we were kind of happy and really, we were happy with the result and all the big undulations that we had managed to remove. But because of this paint layer that I was mentioning before that is on the reverse, that is really kind of like isolating and not really letting the humidity get to the canvas. So it's like blocking from the humidity having the effect that it would have had on a canvas that didn't have that thick paint layer. We also thought about removing it, but then again, we don't know if this is original. It may have been done by the artist. I mean, it's just a plain color. It's not that it will change much, but it was really thick. It was really difficult to remove, and it was compromising also the original. So it was a very extreme treatment. We also didn't have the time to do it, and we decided that with further information of what is the reason of this layer, we shouldn't remove it. So what we did in the last stage, which with the painting already outside of the Lascaux strainer, we use a bloating paper with some humidity, and then we put weights on top, and we just try to have the humidity more in direct contact, because anyway, it was not reaching the canvas or the paint layer, because it's just touching the paint in the back, the layer of the paint on the back. So this was good as well, because it was quite successful. We did use a bit of heat from the iron, which is also something I don't do it at home, because it's very dangerous to do that. It has to be done by a conservator, because it can really go wrong. Also, if there's varnish layers on top, it can really go wrong, and it can be quite irreversible. So we did that, and then we were kind of like happy with it. So later when you go and have a look at it, you can see that there are still some lines in the very incised, like in an incision line, especially on the skirt, but these lines are due to the movements of the paint on the reverse. And this is something that I put here in my conclusions. This is sometimes that we as conservators have to accept sometimes. I mean, we can't pretend that almost everything is treatable and everything can be done, but sometimes we just have to accept that certain patina of time or damages that have been caused on the paint layer, as Roger was saying before, the royal family painting that we have also in the galleries, is something that is completely irreversible, because there's a chemical reaction that has had an effect on the paint itself. So there's a really big white layer around it, and it doesn't show the vibrancy that the colors may have had before. But this is something that we can't revert. It's just a chemical reaction of very complex. I won't go there because that's a bit complicated to explain. But sometimes we just have to accept that, certain things are just going to be part of whatever the painting has been faced to, whatever damages, whatever previous interventions that some other people may have done with the best intention, but maybe not the best skills. We finally accepted what it is. We're happy because the painting can be shown in a much better way than when it arrived to us. And that's part of what we do. So as I was saying before, we do create like a dialogue with the artwork, because it's a very long process. It starts from the photo, then we have a wonderful microscope as well that we use to look like in 3 dimensions on the paint, and that kind of like shows you a lot, and you can even understand the painter's brush stroke and how he would have applied the paint. So slowly during this dialogue process, you kind of like see what are the things that you should be doing. It's also based on experience, and it's based on the trained eye of a conservator that from all the previous things you've seen before can tell you what is the most suitable approach for every treatment and every painting. And then we engage with curators as well. So every single thing that we do, I mean, some things are quite straightforward. We don't consult them all the time, because then they wouldn't be able to do their job. But when it comes to these aesthetical issues, they have to come into the picture, because it may make a very big difference and a big change on what is the original appearance of the artwork. And if the appearance is going to improve, then we go ahead and we decide to just go ahead with the different treatments. So this is more or less what we've done in these two pieces.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, like, you know, we curators, we also really need to be in dialogue with the conservators as well. Because, like, yes, we have a lot of the, like, latest equipment, all of this technology, and, you know, some of these are, like, you know, sent to us. But, you know, sometimes I'm looking at all of these, you know, science was never my favorite subject at school, sorry. But, like, sometimes I'm looking at, like, all of these, like, graphs, and I'm, you know, I wouldn't understand what I'm looking at if I'm not in, you know, in conversation, you know, with someone like Mar, you know, who can, you know, guide me. I'm like, okay, so what does this mean, you know, and how can this, you know, help us to better understand the artwork and the artist? Yeah.
Yeah.
When they have it.
So yeah, we need to work together, and this is, you know, this is part of what we do during the process of conservation.
So, are there any questions from the floor, or shall we keep talking? Because there's other things to say. Yeah. With the sleeve?
The one of the varnish removal? Before? Yeah, because the yellow tone is the yellow varnish, yeah. Yeah, because I removed it. Let's see. Let's go back. Oh no, I think it's the light of the photo as well. No, it's not that. Yeah, I think that maybe the light is not so good. Yeah. No. You can see it. It's quite brownish. Yeah, I think it's the light of the photo. Yeah, maybe because some of these photos we took them in the lab because we were really rushing this treatment as well. So yeah. So when we clean, we clean by volumes. So we always follow a volume because it's not good to clean doing straight lines. I mean, they're really good for the photo, the straight lines, like cleaning halfway through a face or things like that, but that may become very irreversible with time. So it's a really flow. I mean, it's like you need a lot of sensitivity to carry out this treatment and a lot of experience as well to be able, and it's also part of what your hand tells you because you can actually feel when you're removing the varnish. You can feel how the cotton swabs moves around, and you feel how you're slowly opening the varnish layer and slowly getting into it and opening it up and dissolving it. So yeah.
That removal of the yellow varnish color was really one of the most exciting things, I think, for us, because the painting, you know, you can see that it's the composition of the painting is very similar to a photo studio portrait, which was very popular at the time. Everywhere, but in particular it was very popular in Rangoon. There were many photo studios downtown where the artist had his studio, and gentlemen like this one who's portrayed in the picture, we don't know who he was, but he was for sure some kind of a civil servant, government official, fairly high ranking. People like this would also have had photo portraits taken. And so this was clear to us that the composition, the artist had chosen a composition that very closely kind of echoed photo studio portraits. And the other thing that was clear to us was that the artist was paying a lot of attention to these kind of imported fashions. So there's the cane that the gentleman is holding. There's a ring on his finger. There's this fine crystalware on the table. There's the velvet tablecloth, as I mentioned, with these sort of very rich tassels also in the velvet curtains in the background. But what wasn't clear to us was that the longi, the Burmese skirt, had also been painted with this very fine detail. So initially it was covered with this yellow varnish. It looked like he'd sort of just rushed through that in order to focus his attention on these kind of imported European fashions. But in fact, the artist had spent just as much care and attention in rendering the kind of intricate folds of fabric in the Burmese longi there as well, which was an interesting discovery for us. And as for the relationship to the photo studio portrait, after the cleaning, it became clear to us that if you look at this portrait, there's a sort of a very convincing naturalistic rendering of the volume on the face, but the depth of field is quite shallow. So it doesn't look quite realistic the way he's depicting space. It's a little bit flat. Unlike most naturalistic sort of realist portraits like this of the period by artists who perhaps had more of a formal academic training, where they would have had more kind of tonal variation to show the background would be darker so that we get more of a sense of spatial illusion. That's not there in this picture, and that sort of shallowness very much resembles a photograph where the photographer's lens captures the light throughout the entire room, and so you often get this sort of flatness as well. So seeing that the background really was quite pale in tone, and then also seeing that the longy skirt really was rendered in such exquisite detail were two kind of new discoveries for us that we would never have been able to see until you'd removed that horrible brown-yellow varnish.
And it was exciting as well for us because we don't normally have that kind of yellow varnish layer in the paintings we have in our collection, because most of these paintings are not even varnished. So this is not like the old masters that have those never-ending varnish layers that have been oxidized along the centuries. So yeah, for us, when it comes to removing varnish, we all get super excited and everybody wants to carry out the treatment. So yeah, it's fun, yeah. It's fun, but it's also one of the most dangerous treatments in conservation, because when it comes to cleaning, as I said before, you really need a conservation skills. You need to understand a lot of chemistry, because that involves chemistry. And sometimes we get people that come to visit us in the lab and they ask us, oh, so how can I clean this painting? And sometimes I feel bad because I feel they think that maybe we don't want to tell them our secret, but there's just not one magic formula. I mean, that was in the past when in the old restoration times, people had magic formulas, everything was very secretive, people didn't want to share it. So yeah, it may take 1 or 2 days of doing lots of tests with a lot of different chemicals, with different mixtures, until we can find out what is the best. And yeah, the damage that can be caused by cleaning a painting with something that is not adequate, even water may be extremely harmful if you go into using water to clean a painting. So yeah, not to discourage anybody, but yeah, maybe please don't try to clean paintings, because yeah, it's really complex. And sometimes it just cannot be done. I mean, we have a lot of paintings here that are very, I mean, they're still drying, because oil takes 100 years to dry. So some of these paintings are not even 100 years old. So if the oil is still very mature and very fresh, removing a varnish may be very risky, because you may be removing the original oil paint layer as well. So sometimes we just have to compromise and say, okay, it can be clean. Maybe in the future it will be clean. Maybe there's new methods, because we're continuously developing in conservation. And I mean, I studied 20 years ago, and there's things now that didn't exist at that time. There's even deterioration or alterations on paintings that we didn't know how to name. We call it efflorescences. Now they call it metal soaps. So, it's an ongoing science. We work with science conservation as well, which is a quite new discipline. And yeah, there's always new materials, there's always new research, new ways of introducing. We're also trying, internationally, conservation is also trying to move away from using very hazard materials, because some of them are very bad for us as well. Certain solvents are extremely dangerous, and yeah, they can be very bad for our health. So we're trying to go into a more green approach, also because the removal of those, then disposing those materials there's a lot of factors that come into it, and there's a lot of people doing research. It's hard because there's never enough money to do, especially overseas, because it's difficult. But yeah, there's a lot of very clever people trying to come up with new materials, and yeah, and we just keep on learning. It's not, you don't reach a level when you know everything. And I'm so grateful to be working in this collection, because working with a collection it gives you knowledge on certain pieces, it adds that extra value of understanding your collection, knowing what you've been working on, and yeah, it's very exciting. I knew this was going to be one of the questions. Yeah, both of these paintings were done under extreme tight deadlines. So I think we may have spent, I mean, in this one, I didn't work on my own. My colleague here, Irene, she also worked on this painting, and other colleagues as well, because we were doing a lot of things at the same time. So I think we may have spent 100 hours in total, all of us, in this painting, and probably in the other one as well, 80 hours or something like that. So, yeah, more or less estimate, yeah. I mean, they weren't extreme, extensive treatments, but yeah, they do have quite a lot of hours. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, then we applied a layer of varnish, yeah. So then because there was a varnish previously, then we put again another varnish. Also because once you remove a varnish, the colors become less saturated. So if a painting has been varnished, you definitely, mostly all of the times, need to apply another varnish. So what we do is we apply a varnish that is conservation grade. So we don't apply like Talent, Rembrandt, Winsor & Newton. I mean, they're good for artists, but not for conservation. So there was a big research done some years ago on resins that are very reversible. So the resins that we use can be easily removed any time. Because we used to use natural resin varnish, like Dammar, because Dammar, along the years, we know that is a natural resin varnish, is what the artists used in the past, and that definitely is easy to dissolve anytime. It doesn't, because there's a chemical process which is called cross-linking, is a chemical term. And when that happens, then a varnish becomes irreversible, meaning no solvent can dissolve it. So that happens with the commercial varnishes. But I mean, when artists apply them, they apply them with a different intention than we apply them. We follow in the code of ethics of conservation. We only apply things that can be reversed always. So this varnish that I applied can be, if anybody were to decide to remove it in the future, it will be easily reversible with normal solvents.
So you bring things without varnish, like, do you varnish?
No. Normally, no. No, actually, no. And that also comes into discussion with the curators because, I mean, if a painting is unvarnished, it was the artist's intention not to varnish the painting. So then it's not up to us to come and varnish the painting because then it will change the whole appearance of what the artist intended. So Clarissa and I and Roger as well, we were working on these Cambodian paintings. They're in the lab now, the George Crosslett. And this artist didn't varnish his paintings, but these paintings are from 1914 and they're quite unsaturated. So we did decide in that case, after discussing with them, to apply a very thin layer of varnish that actually now is not even, you can't really see a varnish, shiny varnish layer because it's really, really thin, but it does saturate the colors. So yeah, in certain cases, I mean, he didn't intend to put the varnish, but maybe because he was just, these paintings were very plein air or like very fast sketches. So maybe they were not intended to have a varnish layer, but it helps us saturate the colors. So yeah, it can come into discussion, but normally from our approach, we wouldn't do it. It will have to be just because yeah, in this case, it helps see the colors more saturated as they would have been. Because oil with time also becomes transparent. So it will be more and more transparent, and it's a very fast painting, so there's not a lot of paint layer. So sometimes it may help. But that's kind of like, that's why we always, when it comes to aesthetical approach, we always discuss with them. Because aesthetical is something that is not necessary, it's just an addition. And that definitely requires somebody else's opinion as well. Can't just be the conservator.
Other questions?
Yes.
So what would you test it on? Because it won't be on the original.
No, it's in the original. So what we do is we have like a very methodological way of working. So we have like a table, and in this table, what we do is we normally do it on the edges of the canvas. So this wasn't the first solubility test. This was when I was already trying to show Roger and Clarissa what was going to be the final result. So we go to the edge of the painting and we take very small sections and we just roll very small cotton swabs. And then we keep our cotton swabs to also differentiate. So when it comes to the test, we have to test all the different colors because it may be easy to remove the varnish. For example, white on the white tones, white is the pigment that dries faster. But when it comes to blacks or browns, normally they're still very wet. So if you have a painting that has white areas and you just carry out the test there, you will mean, oh yeah, it's fine. No, the white is not moving, there's no color coming out. But then you may find out that the blacks are sensitive to the solvent you're using. So we follow, this is a bit complex, we follow like a triangle, solubility triangle. So we have this already prepared test of different solvents. So there's an order, it's very methodological. And yeah, we just carry out in the small section. So yeah, sometimes if they can be cleaned, then we just touch up those little samples and just apply varnish again if we decide that we can't go ahead and clean. So yeah, no, it has to be in the actual, yeah, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to know what's going to remove the varnish, yeah.
I think we've talked a lot more about the Saya Myit than about the Emiria Sunassa. So maybe if there's no other questions from the floor, I'd like to turn back to the Emiria Sunassa. For those who don't know, hanging to the left of the painting, the other work there is also by the same artist from around the same period. And it really strikes me that it's a very similar palette. It's very dark tones. Was there any question for you when you were treating the Emiria work that perhaps there were lighter colours underneath, or do you feel that this sort of dark palette is really true to her original intentions as well?
I do think it's really her original intention, because also this painting came as a new acquisition, I think 3 years ago or 4, and it came with other paintings. There was a total of 5, I think. So when we were working on this painting, we had another of her painting, which is some flowers. I think it's chrysanthemums. So it's an image of some chrysanthemums in a jar. So we brought both paintings to the lab on purpose as well, because we know so little about her. I mean, we treat certain paintings like Georgette, Liukan, we've seen so many of them already, we know them so well. But with Emiria, we don't know that much about her. So I decided to bring both paintings at the same time, so in a way we could compare and see if there were differences or similarities. So there is, yeah, it's very particular, her palette, and there's a certain type of like tone that she applies, like a darker tone or patina, that it may be intentional. Yeah, the thing is that we know so little, we would need to take a cross-section, because from the visual analysis we gather certain data, then the next data we could gather is taking a small sample. So with a small sample, you can put it into different machines and it can tell you like different composition of the materials, and you can also create like you can see the layer by layer from a cross-section, and then you can identify the different layers that she may have applied and how thick one is, how thick, but we haven't reached that stage because also now we didn't have the time, but we hope that that is something that we can continue doing. We still have the other one in the lab because that wasn't selected for rotation, and we did look at it very much underneath the microscope. So yeah, we don't have anything conclusive, but we did gather a few data, and yeah, the palette is quite interesting. We did try, because there does seem to be like a layer of something that looks like a varnish, but it's really thin. You can see it over, let's see if we can see the UV lights. Can we go back? I think in the UV light you can see a little bit. There was some kind of fluorescence of something, which doesn't mean it has to be a varnish layer, like a varnish on itself, intentional varnish. So there is something that fluoresces, because this, as you can see, is very opaque and very matte. So there is a layer of something, but I'm not really sure that is really just varnish. So we did some solubility tests to try to remove it. And the color that came underneath actually was quite bright. But I don't know, from my intuition, from the conservation eye, is that may not be her final intention. She may have applied, because all these paintings have the same tone, the same, so that's what makes me think, is this a patina? So at this point, with the references that we have and the information that we have, I don't think we're in the position of removing that, because we may come up with something very bright, but that may not be the original intention, because artists apply patina, especially in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of artists that use tainted varnishes, and that is totally like intentional. And then if you remove that, how are you gonna that's something that, I mean, you can remove varnish and apply another varnish, but if you remove something that was intentionally meant to create a patina or a tone of like these like darker tones, and you remove it, that you can't put it back again, because you can't taint your own varnish and see, oh, because that's very artistic. We wouldn't be able to imitate that, because that would be trying to fake Emiria, and that wouldn't be right. So yeah, for what we have now, it was not the moment to go ahead with that. But there is a bit of a kind of like vibrant, especially on the blue later. Maybe you can have a look on the blue flower on the top. There's some blue tone, and that did seem quite bright, trying to remove that layer. But yeah, I don't know. I think it may be intentional. So we decided not to go ahead at the time now.
We may not have her writings, but do we know her biography? Do we know what happened to her? This is for the war years, right? The World War II years. Do we have any information about?
I mean, she was active during that period, but even then, it's still, I think not enough information, to make that call to do like, more extensive conservation treatment. And yeah, what we do know is that she did do other versions of her work, or maybe rework her earlier paintings later. So, knowing that, we didn't feel like, that we wanted to do something as invasive as removing overpainting, because that actually...
About that. My question is her biography. So was she from a rich family? If she was a woman, why was she painting? Like, more about her life. Not just the painting. Maybe it's out of context, but I thought, can it still be relevant if we have any information?
I think even with her... Yeah, so even with her, with her biography, I think Heidi, who did her thesis on her, actually found it quite challenging, because a lot of them are, anecdotal. So even, establishing like her birth year and her death year was actually extremely challenging also for her. And even her death year, she just had to also kind of make the call that someone who was her friend who wrote on her was probably more reliable, and calling that. So it actually can be, quite complex.
So we know for a fact that because she was a member of Persagi, this collective, they were exhibiting actively throughout the war years. It was a sort of a nationalist collective. They were featured in propaganda magazines that were produced under the Japanese occupation. So we know that she was actively making and exhibiting her art during the wartime years. But all of this sort of uncertainty that exists, actually other art historians, a woman called Wulan Digantoro, who's written sort of feminist art history of Indonesian modern art, speculates that these different stories and myths about Emiria, the tiger hunter, the poison maker, all this sort of thing, that these were actually sort of deliberately cultivated by her. So it was she herself who claimed to be a princess, but we don't know if that's true. And that this sort of encouraging of multiple versions of her biography increased the sort of sense of mystery, and meant that we could never really pin down who she was as a person, and thus perhaps makes more of a focus on, one, the collective that she sort of circulates in, and two, the work itself. But, yeah.
She wasn't a trained artist, no? So, I mean, she didn't go through a training. That's why also her when she chose her material, she may have chose just whatever she found and experimented with things. Because in another painting that we have from her in the collection, there was a layer of something that looked like a soil, like some type of like dust, but it may have been intentional as well. So yeah, that's why we were saying before, you really need to put into context. And I mean, whatever we do in this painting, whatever we decide, it has to be a similar approach with the other paintings that we have by her, because we can't go into just going ahead and removing things here and then leaving the other one. So it's a dialogue of all the things that we can find from her. And yeah, unfortunately, we don't have that much information of what... Yeah, it could be exactly. We can't even make a statement of what she chose it for, because actually a lot of Southeast Asia, well, even Western artists use plywood. So I mean, plywood is something that, yeah, a lot of artists choose just because it's easy, it's accessible, or maybe their intention is to have a flat surface to create and not have to, do something on a fabric material that will give a end up result different. Because it's interesting, I was looking at the other one, the next one to this, which is actually one I haven't had the opportunity to look at it in the lab, because it's been here, I think, all the time. And now looking at it, it looks like it's a canvas for sure, but I think it's glued onto a board as well, because it's very flat and it has like some lines of distortions. So she may have, she may have felt more comfortable when she was applying her paint using something flat. So yeah, that's something we can certify, or we can assume. It's just a speculation of what maybe the reasons.
About 5 or 6, I think. Yeah. So not all have actually been on display yet, because as you know, like the Southeast Asia Gallery, there's like a certain chronology and narrative. So sometimes our new acquisitions don't fit this particular narrative, but it's something that we hope to use in like our changing exhibitions when we have another opportunity to do so. What's the question? Yes, yeah. So I think that's the advantage when we have more than one painting by one artist in the collection.
Because we have so many.
Yes, yeah. So another thing that Heidi also mentioned in her thesis, that the other painting that's there, Orang Irian, yeah, it's made on canvas, and she said that it's actually likely one of her first paintings that was made on canvas, and she hypothesized that it was because that it's more expensive, and it was probably also more difficult to procure. Yeah, so it's quite
that's
interesting.
Yeah. No, the colors are no. The photography is. It's
also photography. So sometimes when you're
no. I think it's because depending on the light you use to take the photography, the colors may change a lot. Yeah, I think this is so overexposed. So then when you overexpose, the tones don't become the original tones anymore. I mean, I don't know where that photo's mine. No. I'm not so sure. Because, we normally you do the photographies in a photo lab where we use like photo lights, and then we have a camera with the filters and everything adequate. So, in theory, all the photos have the light that they look like. But yeah, this was interesting as well, because when we're looking under the microscope, later maybe you can see there's this, another thing that made me think that she may have retouched the painting herself is that there's some little red, she applied these little red brush strokes that are like fruits or some kind of red details. And that seems to be, she may have done it at a later stage. So it may have been part of when she was retouching the area, that big area of loss. They probably also had a water damage, because on the lower part, you will see in this area here, this is quite extreme, and it may have been because it may have been exposed to water leakage or something. So that's why she may have it stored in an adequate space, and then something happened. And this looking under the microscope, these little red spikes look like they have been applied afterwards. The way they're positioned, they're positioned on top of the original. So she may have decided to do that, and then let me put this red. It could have been like a reworking of her. She may have decided to add some details afterwards.
That's a mercenary question. How much would this painting cost?
Oh, that I don't know.
This is something that
I think we're not really allowed to say, but it is an interesting question, though, because I mentioned Sujiyono, who was one of the co-founders of the collective that she was a part of, and who's a much better known artist. In part because he was more prolific, but in part also because he wrote, and because he's a man, but because he wrote extensively, and his family and estate holds a kind of comprehensive archive of his writings and documentation of his work and so on, which means that it's easier to do research. But of course, it's a chicken and egg situation. But for an artist like Sujiyono, the prices for his artworks when they sell at auction or in the open market are quite high, whereas there's not such an extensive market for Emiria's works, and when they have sold at auction or in the open market, the prices are generally lower. So higher prices lead to more research leads to higher prices, and conservation is a part of that cycle as well, I suppose. Maybe it's a good time to finish. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Mar.